they were coming very close to a solution. In fact, in their final press conference in January, the two sides had a joint press conference, and they stated that with a few more days they might iron out everything. There were still some points of disagreement, not trivial ones, but the major issues there was at least a basis for settlement, something pretty close to settlement, and they thought they could go on to a full settlement. Well, at that point, the Israeli Prime Minister, Barak, terminated the negotiations prematurely, and that was the end of that, almost. That was the end of formal negotiations. But informal ones continued, again at a high level. High-level officials on figures on both sides. And they came out with a very detailed proposal. It's called the Geneva Accords, because it was presented publicly at Geneva in December 2003. And that dealt with lots of details. That was agreed by both sides. You can like it or not, I'm just describing what happened, whatever one's opinion is toward that agreement. Well, it was released in Geneva. It's in print. You can find it. It's in English. There's a lot of stuff about it. It was released in Geneva in December 2003. It was welcomed by most of the world, governments and representatives and so on. Israel flatly rejected it. The United States disregarded it. So if you look at the commentary here, almost nothing. Maybe you find a small news item somewhere. Well, that's the double veto again. When the U.S. rejects something, it doesn't happen, and it's wiped out of history. Except for people who want to understand history. For them, it's not wiped out. Well, that's, a lot of things have happened since the last decade, but my own view is that nothing that's happened makes that outcome impossible. They make it harder, but I don't think it makes it impossible. So in my view, at least, this possibility is still unopened. It's possible to implement the position of the entire world, aside from the rejection of states, and international law, maybe with some modification because of what's happened since. Well, that's about where we stand now. The question is, what are the options? What can we do about it? And we means people here. This is ultimately a decision for citizens of the United States. We have the decisive vote on this. It's not something that people are, recalcitrant opponents are arguing about out there. It's right here. There are several options. One option is the overwhelming international consensus accepted by essentially everyone and explicitly in accord with international law, World Court, Security Council resolutions, and so on. So, for example, when you read in the papers that much of the world doesn't accept the legitimacy of the Israeli occupation, it's kind of an understatement. That means the entire world outside of the United States and Israel. That's the way you have to read that. Maybe you can find somebody in Costa Rica who doesn't agree, but essentially that's what it says, correct? But so one possibility is that the rejectionist states will change their position. Israel's not going to change its position as long as the United States supports it. The countries don't give things up. They don't need it for security. In fact, it harms their security. It's pretty much recognized. But as head of the Israeli Air Force, Cesar Weizmann, later president, as he explained back in 1970, we don't want the occupied territories don't contribute to our security. In fact, they probably harm. But without them, we can't live at the scale and quality and power that we desire, words approximately to that effect. And that's essentially the point. As long as the United States backs it up, it'll continue. And the United States is backing it up. So, for example, right now there's supposed to be a conflict between Obama and Netanyahu over settlement expansion. There's not much of a conflict. If you look at Obama's wording or Clinton's wording, it's extremely mild. Netanyahu, on the other hand, is very brazen and arrogant and has every right to be. He says, look, we're going to go ahead and do it. We don't care what you think or what the world thinks. And he's right. Obama has already made it clear to him that the United States is going to continue to support the expansion of the settlements. So why shouldn't he say it? He's being criticized. I don't see any basis for criticism. Maybe he shouldn't be that brazen. Maybe he shouldn't flaunt his arrogance in Obama's face or something like bad tactics. But basically, it's correct. Obama, when he came into office, he was asked if he made a big talk about how he's going to settle the Israel-Palestine problem. And he said at the time, well, we're opposed to expansion of the settlements. We want to keep to what's called the roadmap. The roadmap was an agreement of four partners, the United States, Europe, Russia, the United Nations, quartet. They agreed a couple of years ago on what they call a roadmap for settlement of the issue, and the first step was no expansion of settlements, no natural growth, no nothing. So Obama was simply saying, okay, I endorse what the four participants laid down as the roadmap. But one of the charges against Hamas is that they don't accept the roadmap. Whether they do or not, we could debate, but it's an interesting charge because the U.S. and Israel immediately rejected it. Israel technically accepted it. This is Prime Minister Sharon, but they immediately added 14 reservations, which completely undermined it. Now, the media here were polite enough not to report this. Activists knew it. You could hear talks, but it broke through to the public, or almost did, in former President Carter's book, Israel, what was called Peace or Apartheid. In that book, for the first time in the mainstream, the reservations were articulated, and in fact, to make sure nobody would miss it, there's an appendix which lists them. And if you read them, you see that they simply undermine the roadmap that the United States essentially accepted. It's kind of intriguing that Carter's book elicited a huge furor and much discussion right here as well. But I've never seen a reference to the one new fact that was brought up in his book, not new to people who've been following closely, but new to the public. See if you can find one. That was silence. But it's there. So Israel and the United States immediately rejected the roadmap. And when Obama came in and said, well, I'd like to keep to the roadmap, he was immediately asked in a press conference, the spokespeople were asked, what are you going to do about it if Israel continues to expand the settlements? And the answer was nothing. He was then asked, well, this is only symbolic, they said. He was asked, are you going to do what President George Bush #1 did? You may remember in 1991, George Bush #1 and James Baker, Secretary of State, who are kind of patricians, like to be insulted. They were pretty upset by the fact that Israel was purposely insulting them. So when James Baker would go to Israel, as soon as he'd land, the Prime Minister, Shamir, would publicly announce, we're starting a new settlement. Just saying, I won't repeat the words, but you know what they are. And Baker didn't like it. Like it insulted to his face, and Bush didn't like it. So they imposed a penalty, a very mild penalty, but they said they would withhold loan guarantees in the scale that Israel was using to expand settlements. It was a mild penalty, but real. And Israel immediately backed down, as they always do, confront U.S. power for that reason. So they changed from Shamir to Paris. And Paris is more westernized. He understands the norms of Western hypocrisy. That's why he's considered a wonderful diplomat. He didn't, when Baker showed up, he didn't announce the settlement that day. He said, yes, Mr. Baker, we agree, no more settlements. And 2 weeks later, the started the settlement, which is fine for Bush and Baker. They didn't care. Just didn't want to be insulted. They didn't oppose the policies. When this continued during the Bush 1 years, when Clinton came in, he essentially backed off from it. He didn't drop the policy, but he gave Israel the authority to determine the expenses that were being devoted to settlement expansion. You can imagine what the results of that were. Elicited considerable ridicule in the Israeli press, properly. But that essentially ended. When Obama was asked whether he would do anything like that, he said no. His spokesperson said no. This is pure, what we're doing is only symbolic, which is telling Prime Minister Netanyahu, go ahead and do what you like. Essentially what it amounts to. So when he insults Obama to his face, as they just did a couple of days ago, he has some justice on his side. That's what Obama essentially told him to do, and he's doing. And we should bear in mind that settlement expansion is a footnote anyway. The issue is not settlement expansion, it's the settlements. That's the issue. It's expansion, of course, is illegal too, but the settlements themselves are illegal for the reasons I mentioned. Well, what are the options today for us? One option is that U.S. policy will change, as it did briefly in Thailand and then return to the norm. The U.S. will abandon its rejectionist stand, join the rest of the world in calling for the settlement that's, you can debate details, but the basic outlines of it are pretty clear, not controversial, have been for 35 years. That's one possibility. It's commonly argued that that's now impossible. I suspect that Diana, who was here a couple days ago, probably said that, and it's very widely held. It's a project of settlement has gone so far that this is impossible. Personally, I don't believe it. I think that there are simple ways to implement it, talk about it if you like. But bear in mind that if that's impossible, then it follows that any political settlement is impossible because there's no real alternative to this. It's held that there is an alternative. If you follow the debates on this issue, you'll see that among Palestinians and among supporters of the Palestinians, it's commonly proposed that Israel should take over the whole of former Palestine, the entire West Bank, and I'll come back to Gaza. The entire West Bank, as one Palestinian high negotiator, sorry to say this, said, we'll give Israel the key. They can take the whole thing. And then we'll carry out a civil rights struggle, an anti-apartheid struggle, like South Africa, maybe in that one. That's a completely academic proposal. There's no reason in the world that Israel would ever accept it. They don't want to be, they don't want the Palestinians. And they have an alternative. These are not the two alternatives. There's a third alternative. The third alternative is what the U.S. and Israel are in fact doing. They can continue with that. And what they're doing is not obscure. See it right on the ground. If you happen to be there, you can read about it if you want. The details are quite plain. They're essentially implementing a plan which has a lot of antecedents, but it's now pretty much identified with Ariel Sharon, called the Sharon Plan. That was later made explicit by his successor, Ehud Olmert, Prime Minister, who called it convergence. He actually presented it to Congress in 2006 to standing ovation. Convergence, Sharon Plan, means that Israel takes everything behind the what's called the separation wall. It's actually an annexation wall, which cuts through Palestinian territory, puts a lot on the Israeli side,